I noticed as I came in that the title isn't quite what I gave it. In 1776, George Mason wrote to George Washington that he was staying at home rather than going on to the Virginia Convention because he knew it would be taken up with 1,000 useless proposals, not miracles. He didn't expect miracles at one time, but at any rate. Well, George Mason suffered from a very painful swelling in his left leg for a large part of his life, especially as he grew older. And as a result, he was very fond of staying at home if he could avoid going somewhere else. So as a result, Colonel Mason will not be with us this afternoon for a YouTube interview. He's still at Gunston Hall, and consequently, I'll have to introduce him. Let's get the first one here. This is George Mason. This was painting made for his wedding when in 1750, when he was 25 years old. One of the interesting things about this painting, and I'm always confused myself, I don't remember whether it's by Wollaston or by Hesselius, but it was an itinerant painter working in Virginia. And there are a number of paintings like this made around the same time in which a prominent Virginia planter is wearing that same set of clothes. So I suspect that the painter had a stock of bodies and then simply put your head on the body. So it certainly is what George looked like in 1750. Now, 21 years later, he had probably aged a bit, but this is who he was. He was married, let's see, this guy,
The next one?
yeah.
Okay.
He married Anne Heilbeck. This is the other one of the pair of paintings. He married Anne Heilbeck, whose father, William Heilbeck, came to Virginia in 1725. He was representing a Whitehaven firm trading in tobacco. He set up a store across the Potomac in Prince George's County, more or less across from where the Masons lived, across the Potomac. The Mason property is on Doge's Neck, on the Potomac, a little below Alexandria, and of course Washington. And he married, this is Mr. Heilbeck, he married after he had his store for years, married a local widow who had substantial property. And by 1750, he was Colonel William Heilbeck with a fairly large plantation, and as well as continuing to be the representative of these Whitehaven England merchants. And he represented George Mason's mother, who was a widow. When he was 10 years old, his father drowned crossing the Potomac. The Masons also owned substantial land on the Maryland side. He was crossing the Potomac and something came up and the boat foundered in the middle of the river. It was obviously a very small boat, and he lost his life. So Mrs. Mason turned to William Heilbeck to be sort of the manager for the Mason properties, as well as his own and his business. He lived in the very common. So in 1750, when she was just turned 17, George Mason married Anna Auerbach, who obviously he had known almost all his life. And so they were very happily married. There are some things that he wrote that you think, oh my goodness, this was an ideal couple. They really had a happy life. They had a number of children. Now, this is sort of the background of who George Mason was. Now, the next one is in 1758, Mason built this house. This is Gunston Hall. Roy Hunt was one time going to give a paper on Gunston Hall because he thought it was one of the most beautiful buildings in the United States. And it certainly is. It is not a large building. It consists of 4 rooms on the main floor. They're quite high ceilinged rooms. And the one is a bedroom, one is a library, and the other 2 are for entertaining guests. One is the dining room, the other is what you call sort of a parlor. He wrote to his brother Thompson Mason, who was studying law in England at the time, and said, could you get me a good joiner? So Thompson Mason found William Buckland, and William Buckland came to Virginia as an indentured servant to work on the house for the Mason family. And I won't spend too much time running into these sidelines, but he became one of the outstanding architects that has ever been in America. He built all kinds of individual houses, all of this Georgian or Palladian style, and churches. The Maryland State House, which is still there in Annapolis, and really was a very significant person in American archaeology. He came as this indentured servant joiner to build Gunston Hall. And interestingly, Gunston Hall, this is the front, and the front door looks down to the Potomac River. It does not look to the road that you would come in if you were visiting it. It looks to the river because that was the main highway for these people. So the fact that the Masons had property in Virginia and Maryland, which would be very difficult to get back and forth to now with roads and rather distant bridges, but in those days, I was just sail across. All right, yeah. I sort of introduced George and his family, and let's look at the next one. This is 1769 resolves of the Virginia Convention, the first Virginia Convention. Am I doing something wrong?
Just gonna check on something. It's all right. Continue.
Okay. I just expect I'm doing something wrong or whatever this technology is called. So anyway, this was held when the House of Burgesses in Williamsburg passed a resolution calling for the repeal of the Townsend Acts, which were a direct tax they argued on the American colonies. Governor Pontoise promptly dissolved the House of Burgesses, and the members went over to the Rolling Tower, and they met there and decided that they would have a Virginia convention made up of delegates from different counties, all the counties, elected by the people there, and they would respond to this. So in that meeting, which happened in, I think this was, I think they were dissolved in June 1769, and the Virginia convention met toward the end of summer. But I may be confused on that. It doesn't matter, I think. So when they met, George Mason drew up the resolutions that the 1769 Virginia Convention duly adopted. And these start with a great deal of loyalty, not only to the crown, but also a real friendship to the British merchants trading to America, because they had been so influential in getting rid of the Stamp Act. So he's been being very careful. But Virginians owe a great monetary debt to these merchants. We certainly want you to be paid. We don't want you to lose it. But remember that if you're a little hesitant to join us on this. So it's a very positive kind of thing, but it has some quite interesting elements in it. One of them is, and this is the first time we do this in Virginia, is if the Townsend Act is not repealed by the 1st of November, we will no longer import any goods of any sort from Great Britain. However, not to offend our friends the merchants, if an order is already on hand, or certainly if it's already being shipped, yes, no problem, land it, we'll pay for it. But no more after that. However, he adds, we will not take any goods from Europe at all. And specifically, we will not import any wine. And the reason for not wanting to import wine was that most of the wine trade, certainly with Great Britain and with the colonies, was in the hands of an expat and British merchants. So there are all sorts of British firms. Occasionally you see these names on Portuguese wine or Bordeaux. These are very English surnames. Well, that's because the firm was started by expat Britishers. So all of these, no, we don't want to report any of these things after November 1. However, we will import anything of the produce or manufacture of Ireland. And you wonder why on earth is Ireland exempt? And I think it's fairly clear it's because the Irish trade in grain was of great significance to the Chesapeake colonies. And in fact, most of the imported grain in Ireland, as opposed to those imported into Great Britain, came from the Chesapeake, especially from Maryland. So at a point when many tobacco planters, because of the price differential, are going over to growing wheat, it seemed like, well, yeah, we want to keep our friends in Ireland buy our grain, our flour, so let's not, bite our heads off. So that's it there. we will not allow the importation or sale of any slave. So it isn't just the slave trade we're aiming at, although Virginia was trying to curtail it at that point. But it's just we don't want any more slaves coming into Virginia. And finally, there is a provision, my mind just lost. Well, it's a very interesting thing. It's all written by Mason. And that sense that let's take the next one here.
Did it move forward?
I read it around to see what it is. It should be the same.
There you go. There you go.
Since this is 1774. We've had the Boston Tea Party in December. We have had the Intolerable Acts punishing Massachusetts in April, and in June, the replay of what happened before. The House of Burgesses passed a resolution denouncing the intolerable acts and standing firm with our brothers in Massachusetts. And the new governor, Governor Dunmore, promptly dissolved them, and they all trotted over to the Raleigh Tavern, and there they drew up another set of resolutions. These are much stronger. They make a very strong case that Parliament has no authority to do any of this. And they begin, interestingly, because they are also all written by George Mason. They begin, interestingly, with the idea that we saw with Jefferson in his pamphlet, that the people who came to Virginia had all of the privileges and rights, that's the very first paragraph, had all of the privileges and rights of anyone in England. And that was because the rights of Englishmen are pre-existing and you cannot tamper with them. And that's a very interesting point, especially at the present time. But if your right to free speech or to assembly and so on predates the government, then obviously the government has no authority to interfere with it. So this was Mason in 1774. And one other item in here is, which is interesting, is that if Parliament doesn't repeal these objectionable acts, then we will do a number of things to set ourselves economically independent, as well as boycotting all kinds of British goods, including giving up tobacco altogether, because the trade depended very much, or was very profitable for English merchants. So they were hitting at that in 1774. Okay, let's go on. There's an awful lot of artillery. I can't quite read that. What does that say?
The first Continental Congress elected by conventions in each colony.
Yeah, the Virginia Convention of 1774 called for a Continental Congress representing all of the colonies. Let's not do this alone individually. Let's get them all together. They met in the fall of 1774 and continued, officially anyway, until the spring. They had most of them long gone home by that time. And by then, 1775, with Lexington and Concord and so on, we had a war. We now had an army in the field, commanded by George Washington. And so we're moving very rapidly. By the end of that year, it's clear that while the Continental Congress sent an olive branch petition to the Crown, it's clear that the colonies are in open rebellion, British point of view. So when the next Virginia Convention met, and it met in May of 1776, at this point, we're actually rapidly moving toward independence. And yeah, let's get the next one. This is when they met. They adopted a resolution on May 18th, 1776, that these united colonies, or at least this Commonwealth of Virginia, are and of a right ought to be free and independent states. So the Virginia Convention in May 1776 is the first official body that says, yes, we are going to be an independent country. And they directed their delegation in Philadelphia at the Continental Congress to introduce that resolution. And next week, we'll see how that was done. All right, now, let's go to the next one. All right. Yes, here we are. This is the quote. George Mason, who, as I say, had real physical limitations, was in no rush to get to Williamsburg, but he did stay at home and wrote a document. This is his draft of the document that is known as the Virginia Declaration of Rights. And we've got time. Would you get me a light so I can actually read this?
Better?
Yeah, that's you. All right. Between
Hold the mic up to your mouth now.
Yeah, between the 20th and the 26th of May, Mason wrote the Virginia Declaration of Rights, which he heads a Declaration of Rights made by the representatives of the good people of Virginia, assembled in full convention and recommended for posterity as the basis and foundation of government. And he said, and you may find these words familiar, that all men are born equally free and independent and have certain inherent natural rights of which they cannot, by any compact, deprive or divest their posterity, among which are the enjoyment of life and liberty, with the means of acquiring and preserving property, and pursuing and obtaining happiness and safety. That power is by God and nature vested in and consequently derived from the people. That magistrates are their trustees and servants, and at all times amenable to them. That government is or ought to be instituted for the common benefit and security of the people, nation, or community, and of the various modes and forms of government, that is best, which is capable of producing the greatest degree of happiness and safety, and is more efficiently secured against the danger of maladministration. And that whenever any government shall be found inadequate or contrary to that purpose, a majority of the community find an indubitable, inalienable, and or find it, and I'm sorry, I can't read even right here. I'm so dim. Or the majority of the community find it indubitable, inalienable, and indefensible right to reform, alter, or abolish it in such manner as shall be judged most conducive to the public weal. And then he goes into quite a number of interesting points, that no man or set of men are entitled to exclusive or separate emoluments or privileges from the community, but in consideration of public service. And so the legislative and executive powers state should be separate and distinct from the judiciary, and that the members of the two first may be restrained from oppression by feeling and participating the burdens they may lay upon the people. They should, in fixed periods, be reduced to a private station and returned by frequent, certain, and regular elections into that body from which they were taken. There's a parallel in this, and that in organizing the Fairfax militia, Mason proposed that the officers should be elected on a regular basis, at least once a year. So if you were Colonel Smith, you would be Private Smith, and Private Jones would be the new colonel. And his whole point was we didn't want military aristocracy. That no part of a man's property can be taken from him, and so on, without his consent. So, and that in all capital and criminal prosecution, a man has a right to demand the cause and nature of the accusation, to be confronted with his accusers or witnesses, to call for evidence in his favor, and a speedy trial by jury. So, I told you this reading this, I thought that no free government or the blessings of liberty can be preserved to any people but by a firm adherence to justice, moderation, temperance, frugality, and virtue, and by frequent references to fundamental principles. And this next one is one that's also is going to be controversial. That as religion, or the duty which is due to our divine and omnipotent Creator, and the manner of discharging it can be governed only by reason and conviction, not by force, and therefore that all men shall enjoy the fullest toleration in the exercise of religion. That all controversies respecting property should be settled by trial by jury. The freedom of the press, the great bulwark of liberty, can never be restrained. The laws having a respect to crimes and punishing offenses sustained before the existence of such laws ought to be avoided. Hence, that all laws should be carefully revised from time to time. Right. So this went on to the committee. The committee made some small changes. Yeah, a very young James Madison, who was Mason was not a lawyer, but Madison was, and he pointed out that there were rights and privileges that people already enjoyed, and that consequently you should have included those. So he added a few basically legal rights and many which ended up in our Bill of Rights, which Mason Madison around the room. And then the other point that now it went to the full convention, and the full convention spent several days debating that opening part. That all men, wait a minute, do you mean my butler whom I bought 5 years ago? Does he have the same rights as I do to liberty, to property? Well, we can't do that. So they struggled with that for a couple of days, and they finally came up with the distinction that all men, when they enter into a state of society, and that is the wording that's still in the Virginia Constitution, that you have to be part of a society, because nobody was going to argue, although actually it was a slightly absurd distinction. Nobody was going to argue that my slaves are part of the society of which I belong. So this is a very, very significant document. And you'll notice how much it overshadows the Declaration of Independence that Jefferson was working on at the same time. And Jefferson used some of the same language. All right, what have we got next? Well, here it is. It was finally adopted June 16th. It took a month, actually, to get the whole thing through. But there it was, the Virginia Declaration of Rights. And it's still the first part of the Virginia Constitution. So this was George Mason's great contribution in 1776. He went on to write the rest of the Constitution for the state of Virginia as adopted in 1776 and continued to be a very great man. He went just one last vignette. He was a delegate at the Constitutional Convention in 1788, and he had any number of objections to the Constitution when it was finally adopted. The most significant one was, where is the Bill of Rights? Where is the Declaration of Rights of the individual? It's not here. Okay. He wanted very small congressional delegated districts with the idea that the people who would be voting would have an opportunity to say, oh, Jimmy Taylor is running for Congress. Well, I know Jimmy, I know his dad. And I'll go over and see him and tell him, I think he ought to put this in his platform. Whereas if you have as we often do now, you have a electorate or electoral district that's so large, he's just a face on a poster or on a television program. So there were several other things that Mason objected to. So the delegates are now moving forward in Constitutional Hall in Philadelphia to sign the Constitution. And George Mason gets up with a lot of difficulty because of his bad leg. And Edmund Randolph, who had been the head of the Virginia delegation, came up and helped him up, took him by the arm, and the two of them walked out. And Mason was then one of the leaders of the anti-federalist party in America, and that's where his last part of his career. But he was a very great, a very sincere man, and one who made a great contribution. So I think I made it to a reasonable point.
Oh.
So you all take them.
We done?
Yes. Questions, comments, challenges? You give me a
Question.
Wait 1 second. I'll take your mic and bring it up.
Thank you, Rick.
How did these men come up with such brilliant, insightful, comprehensive, pro-common people articles? It seems I've been here to all for the two that you've been to, and somehow I have not picked up how these Jefferson and Mason and some of the others could be so not empowered, but brilliant in their view. I mean, these were ideas which were festering about in America. It sounds like, but they were certainly a step directly away from being colonists of a king of another country.
Well, unlike his brother Thompson, Mason had very little formal education. He had tutors when he was a boy, and kind of a little school run on family property. But he was a great reader, and he read everything and digested it. And so similarly, Jefferson was at that point in his life, he had never been outside Virginia. He had limited experience of other things. He was a graduate of Virginia Berry, but they were just very, very intelligent men. And they observed, and they read, and they became competent in many different fields. I don't know that, for example, that Mason ever designed a building, whereas Jefferson was his own architect. He built a couple of buildings, homes, so on. So they were just unusually intelligent people and very, very well read. and very convinced of, of, uh, of this idea of liberty and equality, at least for some people. And they went on in that same way. So, anybody else?
I just have one other question about Jefferson. Jefferson comes under substantial criticism for having a black lover who lived in his premises. And I wonder if the fact that she was a person of a different race and class made little difference to him, that he was truly in love with this person in preference to what would be considered this proper society.
Yeah. I don't know if I really don't know that how we would divine that. One of the interesting, he did that. Jim was actually freed his own progeny. He did not free any of his other slaves. And those years and years ago, I did an article about the Methodist petition for abolition of slavery in Virginia in 1785. And they went around, it was Bishop Asbury went around collecting support, and George Washington, George Mason, Jefferson, Addison, anybody you could think of, all said, oh, slavery is terrible. Yes, we want to get rid of this evil institution. But when it came to be presented to the House of Burgesses, none of them supported it. And none of them, Washington, Mason, any of them, Jefferson, none of them ever just manumitted all their slaves. So it was a case of very much, I think, that in an ideal world, we would not have any slaves. They're saying, in an ideal world, we would not have any nuclear bombs. But do you really want to take the economic hit that liberating all your slaves would give you? Probably not, no. And so there's that kind of a contradiction that when slaves are slaves. And Washington, Jefferson's, I forget her date, she was apparently the daughter of his wife's mother or uncle. And she was not a black woman, she had a lot of white blood in her. And I think the mother was also someone who had a white father and an African mother. So, you know, in a different society, she would have passed, but not in Virginia at that time.
Other comments or questions? I see one in the back.
When the class starts, actually, go to this.
Thank you.
You know,
Richard, I guess I don't know whether it's, somebody was misleading me, but I was listening to a historian when I was in college who, emphatically said that when Jefferson wrote all men are created equal and Mason was saying the same thing, what they really were talking about, that Americans should be, and American citizens ought to be equal to the English, because we were fighting throughout the period of the war and before, or to be recognized as equal to those who were in power in Britain. And I would like to know whether I should go and find that person and disabuse them or not.
Other board? I said to you, may not all heard me, I said, when the class starts packing up their books, you know it's time to wind up. So, yeah, I think it's probably time to wind up. So thank you all for being a great audience. And I hope you'll come back at 3.